So with that being said, the first speaker we have for tonight is the great Jeff Deist. For those of you who are involved in the liberty movement here, I'm sure he is no stranger to you all, but for those of you who might not be as familiar with him, he is the former chief of staff to Representative Ron Paul, which is a name I'm sure most of you are familiar with. He is currently the president of the Mises Institute, as well as the host of the Human Action Podcast, which is a fantastic podcast I recommend you all listen to. And with that being said, Mr. Deist, you have the floor.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, I guess for starters, when we're talking about the Austrian School generally, and that's my goal in the next 30 minutes, is just to give a little background on where we are. When we're talking about the prospects of the Austrian School of Economics, I think it's probably worthwhile to take a look at economics as a whole, the profession, the business of economics, and say, how's it doing? And from my perspective, it's not doing very well. It's actually in deep trouble. And what I mean by that is it's failing to provide much, if any, benefit to society or to humankind, at least from where I sit. In other words, it provides a lot of jobs and sinecures for people, but it does not necessarily help us to understand the world better, at least as it's presently practiced. It's not making us healthier or happier or richer. And the idea behind social sciences is to help people understand or see the unseen, to see what's going on in society amongst human actors, not in the physical world, but in the human world. And if you believe that economics is a social science, that's what it ought to be doing. And that's especially what it ought to be doing during the COVID era. We ought to have economists front and center warning about some of the policies which have been implemented across the world and saying, hey, you can do this, but it might have these effects if you're not careful. But look, I think I'm encouraged by people who study any economics. I'm not entirely sure how many people really have it in high school in the United States anymore, or how many people take it in their undergraduate studies outside of, let's say, business majors who are obviously normally required to take probably micro and macro and maybe a banking class beyond that. So I'm not certain whether most people, or most Americans anyway, I'll admit to an American-centric view tonight, are really thinking much about economics at all. And if you look at the political landscape, you can understand that, because there's a big push to basically create a field we could call anti-economics or counter-economics. And this is the notion or the mentality that economics is a pseudoscience. It's not real. It doesn't really have laws. And what it mostly is a bunch of intellectual cover for business interests, for capital. And that in fact, far from having to worry about the laws of economics or supply and demand or scarcity or any of these things, we can basically command economies, right? By legislative fiat. We can just use positive law. We can legislate prosperity. Economics is just something for politics to tinker with. And I think that's the kind of mentality that lets us believe that a lot of the COVID policies that we've endured over the past couple of years are somehow costless. That we can, for instance, have the Fed do everything it's done with respect to its balance sheet and asset purchases and interest rate targeting over the last couple of years, and that Congress and the Treasury over on the fiscal side, with stimulus and payments, PPP loans to businesses to make payroll when they aren't actually producing a good or service, bailouts to people, that we can have rent moratoriums, that we can let people off the hook for interest on their mortgages, that we can send people home and give them enhanced unemployment benefits for a lengthy period, that we can suspend student loan payments, and that basically all of this is sort of costless. That when all this is said and done, we can just turn a switch back on and the economy will be okay. And there's lots of people who don't even want the switch turned back on. They want the Great Reset. They think people should just stay home and be paid a universal basic income, and that, like the Marxists, we all had deep down, we could all be an artist or a singer or an athlete or something if we just had the time, and we didn't have to worry about the workaday world and paying our bills. So I think there's a real serious problem going on right now that we might call anti-economics or counter-economics. And I think that's behind a lot of the political foolishness which we're forced to endure. But even in the more mainstream profession, where economics is at least viewed as legitimate as a science, I think we're in a very tough spot. I had an interview with Professor Peter Klein a few months back, and he brought up the topic of economists, as plumbers. There's a woman named Esther Duflo who won the Nobel a year or two ago, in part on her. She had written an article called "Economist as Plumber," and what she meant by that, and what Peter Klein explained to me, was that increasingly economists are just viewed as they're sort of they're there to solve public policy problems. There's education's not working very well. Well, let's study it. Or what does the minimum wage hike mean for Seattle? There's this sort of this really mechanical or technical and small focus. So the Austrian tradition of grand theory seems very quaint or archaic or dead wrong, frankly, to a lot of people we might call mainstream or mainline economists. And I mean, they will take this pretty far. If you look at Thomas Piketty, the Frenchman, who is very much a darling of left, I guess we call it FinTwit or economics Twitter, but I call it FinTwit. He basically says that there are no laws of economics, there's only politics. And that's a pretty profound thing to say if we think about it. I mean, that you can basically force things politically and manufacture or engineer outcomes. And that we can do all this politically. And all of this takes the emphasis away from production, right? And efficiency. The whole idea that billions of human beings have to get up every day and produce things, that's almost considered beside the point when you get into this political viewpoint. So Piketty is an example of this. And of course, MMT, modern monetary theory, I think is an example of this idea of almost counter politics, where we can do things in a costless way. And MMTers say that we can basically issue sovereign currency infinitely unless and until there's so much inflation that we need to pull some of it out of the economy via taxation, increased taxes. But, short of that, in a crisis, for example, like 2008, the banking crisis, the housing crisis, or the COVID crisis of 2020, just create money on the fiscal side, not on the monetary side, the banking side, but on the fiscal side, political money, and just hand it out. And so the question becomes, how can millions and millions and millions of people believe this is costless? Well, some economists are telling them just that. So from my perspective, that's pretty dangerous. That's dangerous thinking. But there are glimmers of hope, I think, for the Austrian perspective, or certainly for broader free market perspectives. There's always glimmers of hope, simply because I would like to think, anyway, it's an opinion, that our views represent the real world, markets as they work, humans as they act. And so ultimately reality comes knocking, and there might be some pain involved, but the laws of economics reassert themselves. And what the more theoretical Austrian approach is trying to do is identify those laws through theory and through deduction. So as an example, every once in a while, we, meaning the Mises Institute, and I'm sure other organizations, and I'm sure certain politicians and economists, we get a phone call from the media. And I got a call a couple of years ago, which has stuck with me, from a journalist at the Chronicle of Higher Education. I don't know how many of you follow that, but it's basically a magazine about colleges in the US. And it's unfortunately paywalled, but it leans very left-wing. I'll just say that. And so this journalist called me up and said, I'm calling there's all these free market think tanks at these universities. So I'm sure a lot of you remember a few years ago, there's a big kerfuffle when Nancy MacLean wrote her book about James Buchanan. And, there's increasing focus on the Koch-funded university centers that supposedly promote free market orthodoxy. And we're a little bit outside that. The Mises Institute is not involved with the Kochs, but nonetheless, from the perspective of a left-wing journalist, I'm sure we're part and parcel. So he called me up and he said, can the Mises Institute, or can you guys, what's the science behind what's about all these free market politicians and free markets can solve all these societal problems. Where's the evidence for this? Where's the science? How do we really know that all this free market stuff works? And he was going on and on. And so I wanted to be snarky and say, well, we can look at the 20th century for one. If you're looking for empirical data, you might look at the bloodshed and deprivation and poverty versus unbelievable increases in wealth and well-being and lifespan and all that in the West. But I didn't say that. I just said, it's actually not the case that there's free market fundamentalism overtaking politics. It's actually not the case that Austrian economics principles are dominant in Washington, D.C., or at the Federal Reserve, or in the banking committee chaired by Maxine Waters, or anyplace else. And so I sort of gently said, well, what we really have is kind of what we call a mixed economy or neoliberalism with a strong social safety net and da-da-da. But the thing that I took away from the phone call that was so striking to me was that this journalist, he really imagined himself the underdog. Not that people who see the world like him are in charge, which they are, unfortunately, but that he was some sort of underdog, and there's this sinister plot afoot, this free market fundamentalism. And imagine thinking this because of a few Koch-funded centers around the country, when basically every public university and most private universities in this country are operating as de facto left-wing think tanks when it comes to economics or otherwise. So the fact that he thought this, and the fact that sometimes you'll see journalists in places like the New York Times or the Atlantic, they'll bring up Hayek or Mises, usually in a desultory manner, saying that, oh my gosh, the economics or public policy is in thrall to this free market, this Austrian thing. I mean, the fact that they're worried about it strikes me as good news, that they don't imagine that they've won, so to speak. And that's good. Because what we've got, I'm afraid, in the profession of economics today is a bunch of economists who, with respect to our earlier point, they don't really understand economics as a social science, rather than a physical science that requires testing of hypotheses. They have physics envy. They want to quantify and mathematize and turn everything into an equation. And as a matter of fact, they literally want to pose economic theory as an equation which can be balanced, almost like an algebra problem with variables. So I think that's very problematic, especially amongst the younger economists. They don't understand money as a market commodity or a market phenomenon. It's something that has to be provided politically, I think, what most economists would say. They certainly don't understand inflation as a monetary phenomenon. And economists under 40 don't much understand inflation at all. They've never seen it, or maybe even under 50. They don't understand interest rates as we could say prices in shorthand, but more, I guess, a little more accurately as exchange ratios. They don't understand the role of interest rates. They just view them as policy tools, something to be tinkered with and set, right? That's what interest rates are. They're tools. They can't really explain booms and busts because they don't understand inflation and interest rates. And, they see no role or have no understanding of the idea of time preference in economics. They certainly don't have much understanding or see much of a role for the individual entrepreneur in the whole broader structure of production and how we get stuff. They almost view individuals, even CEOs or whatever, or risk takers, as fungible widgets, almost like the assembly line products themselves. And maybe worst of all, and I know this secondhand, obviously I am a lay reader, not an academic economist or an economist at all, but nonetheless, I'm told by academic economists it's possible today to get a PhD in economics without knowing anything about the history of economic thought or where things came from. So you can become a PhD and you can be a brilliant young person and go to Wharton or Stanford or wherever and go become a quant at some Wall Street bank and make a bunch of money, or an investment banking house, or you can go work at the Fed and you're a legitimately brilliant person, but you don't really know where you came from. You don't know a lot about Adam Smith or Keynes or Marx or anybody else. And it's almost like we dropped them on an island without any pre-existing knowledge. And I think that's especially dangerous when economists are younger, again, because really arguably since Alan Greenspan in the late 90s, we've had from an Austrian perspective almost an artificial economy in the sense that it's been driven by central banking creating demand side demand, right? Let's have lots of money and credit to stimulate demand. So, you could argue that really for the last 20 odd years, 25 years, younger economists haven't really seen what an economist who lived through Paul Volcker, let's say, lived through the 70s and 80s has seen. So Austrian economics is hopefully the antidote to all that. How we would define economics in the Austrian sphere versus the more mainstream sphere. For me as a layperson, I would just say, well, economics is about studying purposeful human action in the context of scarcity and therefore choice. We don't have all the stuff we'd like to have, so we have to economize. Now, I'm sure most of the folks on this call tonight, are at least superficially read in the Austrian School and are interested in it and may be very well read in it. So we use the term Austrian economics, I think, as a broad term of convenience, and I think it has. I think that's probably worthwhile. Why not? I mean, it categorizes things, makes life easier, and sometimes those categories are actually helpful. Some people have suggested we ought to jettison the term, that there's just, I think Milton Friedman famously said there's just good and bad economics. And then other people, even in Austrian circles, have said, well, it's become too politicized or it's become too tied to libertarianism and such and such. And it's, we shouldn't use it anymore. And so I've heard that argument. And of course, the German historicists out of which the Austrian tradition sort of birthed itself, or in contrast to, they used Austrian economics as a term of derision. I guess, those hicks over there in Austria aren't quite as smart and sophisticated as us here in Germany. And, when they said that, the interesting thing about the German historicists was a lot like Piketty, when they say, the only way we can know anything is by virtue of history and experience. And Piketty says there are no laws of economics, only politics. I think both of those narratives are really not only profoundly wrong, but they would have huge, profound implications for epistemology, right? If the only way we can know what we know is through human experience, then that's a hell of a way to look at the world. That's pretty earth-shaking, not just for the social sciences, but the physical sciences as well. So I'm obviously, or we on this call are obviously happy that Carl Menger came along and started this incredible shakeup. Now, even within Austrian economics, of course, there are all kinds of disputes and fights, and there are different lineages. When we think of the Mises Institute or we think of Rothbardians, there is a line, let's say, of economists starting with Menger through Bambergerwerk, and then, of course, Mises. And then it sort of travels through Rothbard and Hoppe and Joe Salerno and Peter Klein and Per Weiland and younger guys today like Patrick Newman, Jonathan Newman. So that's sort of the Mises Institute family tree. And there's at least one other, if not several. But there are other Austrian family trees where you might trace through Menger and Bambergerwerk to Mises again. But then to Hayek, who sometimes we forget was a student of Mises in a sense, and then to, let's say, Ludwig Lachmann, Hans Sennholz, Israel Kirzner, Peter Betke at GMU. So there's not just one definition of Austrian economics, to be fair, and I think that's important to point out. Obviously, I'm biased, but I'm going to just read you real quick something that Joe Salerno wrote, and I'll be brief. He wrote an essay, which is really interesting, called The Sociology of the Development of Austrian Economics. And here he gets into some of these branches and Austropunkism and some of these fights between the Mises Institute and GMU and that sort of thing. But he basically says, when we boil it down, the essence of what makes someone an Austrian, and he reminds us, definitions, have to be essentialist. They have to be exclusivist. That's what a definition means. If a definition isn't essentialist, it's not much use. So when we're trying to define Austrian economics, he says for his money, it's all about praxeology. That's what separates a thoroughgoing Austrian in Salerno's view from, let's say someone Austrian friendly. So I'm going to read just a couple sentences. He says, and this is Joe Salerno, the essence of Austrian economics may be defined then as the structure of economic theorems that is arrived at through the process of praxeological deduction. That is, through logical deduction from the reality-based action axiom. Now that is pretty strict on method, and that would, in part, that would exclude even Hayek from being what we might call a pure praxeological Austrian. So, there are, when we talk about the Austrian school, there are more, different varieties, different flavors of it. But I do think that the Austrian perspective is in better shape, certainly, than when Mises died in the 1970s. He never got to see Hayek's Nobel. He never got to see the South Royalton Conference. And of course, he never got to see the internet, which means that today, through the digital miracle, virtually all the important works of Austrian economics, including Mises, are available to anyone, anywhere in the world, online, mostly free, generally spun instantaneously, and with a few clicks. And as a result of that, of course, millions of more people have read Mises since his death than before. And his name and his work and his legacy, I hope anyway, are more secure than when he died. And I think that's all that any intellectual could ask, that they be, that people continue to read them after they're gone. And I don't think you can say that for most, let's say, former Fed chairs, no offense to them, but I don't think that their legacy grows after they die, or that, whoever is the chair of Harvard right now, or Greg Mankiw, or Paul Samuelson. Is Paul Samuelson's legacy growing since his death? I mean, I don't know. Maybe his grandkids' trust fund is, because he sold a hell of a lot of those principles textbooks. But that's sort of an open question. But I do think the Austrian school is making inroads. Certainly, there are far more Austrian or Austrian-friendly professors around the world at universities of all shapes and sizes. And so that's a good thing, I think. And Austrian journals are flourishing. But I think one of the more interesting cases is where we see Austrianism sneaking into other areas. Obviously, Bitcoin has been, and cryptocurrencies more broadly, have brought a lot of people to Austrian economics. So it's almost an open question whether people like Seyfedin Ammous and Stefan Livera and Bitcoin people have promoted Austrian economics through Bitcoin, or whether because of the promotion of Austrian economics, a lot of people got into Bitcoin. I don't know, which, I guess that's a two-way street. And, obviously, Seyfedin is a very Mises Institute friendly, Rothbardian, Salernoite kind of Austrian. So I think his book, and not only the Bitcoin Standard, but his new book, the Fiat Standard, have done a lot to explain the basic parameters of Austrianism to people. So that's obviously a healthy and happy thing. And we have Caitlin Long working out in Wyoming on legislative efforts with the senator out there, Cynthia Lummis, who's very Bitcoin friendly, and they're trying to set up a state banking regime that would be more friendly not only to cryptocurrency but to banking privacy and full reserve banking and some other things like that. So that's interesting to see. And some of you may know the name Jeff Booth, who is more of a science and tech guy who has come over to Bitcoin in a big way. And he, through Bitcoin, sort of became a fan of Austrian economics and wrote a book called The Price of Tomorrow: Why Deflation is the Key to an Abundant Future. So just the idea that people are talking about sounder or harder money, and that they're talking about deflation as a benign or market activity. In other words, if an economy is healthy and growing, it ought to be getting more productive. And as it gets more productive, the relative or the real cost of goods and services for average folks, middle class folks, ought to be dropping. And for a lot of the 20th century in the United States, we saw that. I mean, automobiles used to be a luxury for the very wealthy. Flying on airplanes used to be a luxury. Having a television, having a closet full of clothes rather than just one or two outfits. Eating out, several times a week as opposed to just once in a while. I mean, all these things are in part the result of deflation as competition and capital accumulation, investment capital made certain industries more productive, and supply and demand worked its magic. And so we're all richer and better off. So I think Austrian economics has helped more people see that deflation can be a healthy and happy thing. I only want to talk till about the bottom of the hour, maybe a few minutes beyond, to leave some time per our host for questions. But let me just say this: as far as the future goes, I'm not sure I love this, but I think the reality is that, at least in academic settings, I think business schools and MBA programs are where Austrian economics is going to find its greatest purchase in the future. And increasingly, you see universities, housing their econ departments under the business school umbrella rather than over, with the humanities or the social sciences, where perhaps it belongs. And so I think entrepreneurship and business schools, people are doing great things like Peter Klein and Per Byland, because it's just reality. I mean, entrepreneurs, when they start understanding capital and the capital structure, and when they start understanding that the only return that matters is the return net of costs and taxes, and also inflation, when they begin to understand money, Austrian economics actually works in terms of, how you think and your mindset in an entrepreneurial setting. So you don't have to sell it as free market fundamentalism or some sort of ideological thing. And I would say, none of us on this call want Austrian economics to be ideological. We want it to be causal realist. We want it to be reality-based economics. Or as Per Byland says, there is the cost, sort of cost theory economics, and then there's market process economics. And that's really a broader way of looking at Austrianism. So I think that business schools may be our future, but even outside of business schools, increasingly entrepreneurial training, executive MBAs, quick and dirty MBAs, certificates, which people are obtaining from places like Khan Academy and Udemy and the Mises Institute, may be a big part of the future, because institutions are suffering mightily. And those institutions are not Austrian, and what they're teaching people isn't much good or much value. Look, PhD economists are getting jobs. They are one of the few bright spots in academia, because a lot of PhDs are out there really struggling, maybe teaching in a couple community colleges, maybe unemployed, maybe working the same job they had before their PhD. So people I do hear enough from people at Auburn and otherwise that PhD economists are finding jobs, but it's not always what we think of as a tenure track academic job at some leafy university somewhere where they can write academic journals all day and smoke a pipe with patches on their elbows or something like that. I mean, I think those days are behind us. And so increasingly, PhD economists are being hired, obviously by the Fed, which is one of the biggest employers, where they just go into a black hole, or tech companies. Tech companies are increasingly hiring economists to help them, just push data around. We mentioned Esther Duflo and getting the PhD economist as plumber. Well, I want to say it's 2017, maybe Richard Thaler. He received the Nobel for this nudge theory BS, which is just, behavioral economics, which I think is just nonsense. It's all about, well, we got to make these psychologically realistic assumptions and treat humans as they really are, which is sometimes irrational. And well, okay, but Austrians have understood that since the get-go. The idea that humans act rationally with their means towards purposeful ends doesn't mean that they are hyper-rational homo economicus or something like that. I mean, it doesn't mean they're infallible or that they're not a drug addict or whatever. It just means that they apply, that we can understand human action from a means ends perspective. So, what I think a lot of these PhD economists are doing at places like Amazon and Facebook and Google, they're just trying to figure out how to nudge people like Richard Thaler. How can we get the monkey to click on ads to add something to the basket? How can we figure out all this data? How can we figure out what 48 to 51-year-old housewives in Hartford, Connecticut want to see as an ad? And that's a little sad. That's not the kind of grand theory that the Austrians are known for. And you can see this, sadly, in the profession. There's just no more treatises. I mean, nobody's writing treatises anymore. The most recent real treatises have been by Austrians. You might consider De Soto's Money and Banking a treatise. He updates that. But human action, man economy, and state, that's not what economists do anymore. They don't write things like that. They've sort of lost that impetus to have interdisciplinary thinking and to treat economics as a grand or sweeping theoretical field that helps us to understand the world, but doesn't necessarily just want to tinker around the edges of some public policy problem. So I'll wrap up. I want to read just real quick. I already quoted Salerno. So let me just quote Mises. A lot of what people seem to want from economists is predictions and mathematical models and statistics and figuring out what's going to happen in the future. So Mises was not that kind of thinker. He said, our ineradicable craving, I'm quoting him, compels us to seek happiness, minimize discontent, and spend our lives purposefully struggling against the forces adverse to us. Civilization, it is said, makes people poorer because it multiplies their wishes and does not soothe, but kindles desires. All the busy doings and dealings of hardworking men, their hurrying, pushing, and bustling are nonsensical, for they provide neither happiness nor quiet. Yet such qualms, doubts, and scruples are subdued by the irresistible forces of man's vital energy. As long as man lives, he cannot help obeying the cardinal impulse, the élan vital, which is French for the vital life force. This is not the kind of stuff I remember from my undergraduate micro class. Let me just put it that way. So I'll leave you with one caution, and that is ignore the gatekeepers, the filterers, that go to original sources. If somebody says something about Hoppe, go read Hoppe. Don't read what some critic says about Hoppe. Go read Menger, go read Mises, go read Hayek, go read Rothbard. You won't be bored. You won't fall asleep by your clock radio at night. You'll actually be energized. And I think it will equip you, regardless of what you do for a living or what your interests are, anything like that. I think it'll equip you as a critical thinker in ways that the profession of economics is not doing. It's falling down on the job, and it's not helping us to see the unseen. So that is my plea, my spiel for this evening, to try to get all of you interested in increasing your time and energy in reading the Austrian School. So thanks, Rich.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Deist. We have a few questions here for you. The first one here comes from Christos, and he asked, you said that you are against mathematical economics. What is your opinion on people who want to mathematize Austrian economics and make it more accessible to the mainstream?
Well, I don't. Mises was derided as a literary economist because when you look at human action, there's not a bunch of equations balanced. I guess I'm biased because I am a lay person, and so I like to see economics more of a subfield of philosophy or logic. But there's nothing wrong with math. I think Austrians, PhD Austrians, ought to be able to do it because those are the waters they're going to be swimming in if they want to refute them. Jonathan Newman, who's one of our fellows, is an excellent mathematician. Rothbard was a fantastic mathematician, undergrad in math. I mean, Mises' brother Richard, was a brilliant mathematician at Harvard, and Mises could do math if his brother could. They came from the same mom. So I think we have to resist it. I think mathematizing things, it's seductive. It's seductive to say that we want the world to solve itself like an equation if we just have the right inputs, like mv equals pt. If we just have the right inputs, we can solve all this. Well, I'm sorry, but when you're talking about social sciences and human animals, things are messy, and that's just the way it is. So we can kid ourselves, or we can try to understand the world the way it is. Math is for math.
Next question here comes from Dabchik. He asks, given your experience with the American version, do you have advice for how non-Americans can deal with their local media/political landscape?
American version of
the local media and political landscape we have here in the United States.
Yeah. Well, it's very tough. I think we are in a very authoritarian period, and it's our job, all of us, people of goodwill, I think, to be talking about the trade-offs. And those could be everything from economic devastation to mental health, to alcoholism, suicide. I was watching a YouTube the other day of some guy walking down First Avenue in New York City. It was just recent. It was like a month ago that YouTube was filmed, and the empty storefronts, the for rent signs, really devastating. So these things are going to have a ripple effect for a long time, and I sure wish we were listening to economists as much as we were listening to doctors and epidemiologists or virologists. I mean, they're not equipped to tell us. They might be equipped to tell us about a virus, but they're not equipped to tell us what the trade-offs in society ought to be in response to a virus. So I think we all have an obligation right now to, I guess, have some courage.
Next question here comes from Clouded Out. He asked, if we could do just one thing to improve the world of economics, what should we do?
The world of economics?
Yes, the world of economics. If we could do just one thing to improve it.
Oh gosh. Here's going to be my Weasley answer. I'm going to say wait for our new Austrian Economics primer, which Per Bieland is producing. It's basically going to be like Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, but for Austrianism. And it's going to be even shorter. It's going to be under 100 pages. It's going to be like a pamphlet. And we're going to carpet bomb every university, every bookstore, every library we can on Earth with them. We'll send you boxes of them. So that's, at some point, no matter how much we all want to use marketing and how much we all want to use memes, how much we all want to use social media, at some point, you do have to ask people to do at least a little bit of thought and reading. Even people who are never really going to take much of an interest. I do think it's on some level, you do have to change hearts and minds. And that requires at least a little bit of, multi-step thinking. And there's no getting around that. So I think where we should take cheer is that changing the world doesn't take 51% of the population. It doesn't even take 31%. It's often done by an energized minority of 5 or 10%. So finding those 5 and 10% and giving them Pear's upcoming book, that's my answer.
Next question here comes from Adam Hammond. He asks, do you see the future crop of Austrian economists coming from the university system or perhaps from a more decentralized online system? Or maybe even one we can't imagine yet?
Yeah, This is my friend Adam in Las Vegas. You know, Mises Institute people, there has been some criticisms posed towards what academics call internet Austrians, which is lay people who learned what they've learned online or informally in their personal time rather than as a profession. And I understand that criticisms. There are dangers in what you don't know, certainly. But I think that academia is lost. And I think we have to accept that. I don't think economics is going to escape woke just because it's not, gender studies or poetry or sociology or something. Economics is not going to escape woke. And we already see central banks putting out ridiculous tweets about equity and climate change and sexism and that sort of thing, things that are wildly beyond their job. And so I think in hindsight, I'm biased, I admit it, but I think in hindsight, it's going to be bottom up. I think Rothbard was right. I think Hayek was wrong about the intellectual structure of production being top down, because what Hayek missed, in Rothbard's view anyway, is that academics have self-interest, right? Seeing the truth or being exposed to the truth, whether you accept it or not, is not enough. I mean, an awful lot of people make a living off the current system of banking, of central banking, of academia, of think tankdom, of journalism, financial and otherwise. So that it's not so much knowledge as it is self-interest. So I think it's going to come from outside of academia, and I hope it doesn't come. I hope that a new era of economic understanding doesn't come because we have some horrible crash in the West where we're all materially much worse off, because that could easily go the other way towards totalitarianism. But I don't think top down. I don't think academia is going to change until it's absolutely forced to.
For one last question here, we have a question from David Brady, and he asks, "Are you hopeful for the future?"
Yeah, I am. I'm more hopeful than I was a couple years ago, certainly because I think they overshot with the COVID response. I think the teachers' unions really overshot. I think an awful lot of people are, for the first time, saying, wait a minute, my kid's watching Zoom all day. If your kid's going to sit home and watch Zoom, then why can't he have the best social studies teacher on earth? Why is he stuck with the one from your local junior high, right? So I do think that the future I think it's going to be rough, but I think it's going to be more decentralized. And I think that'll work its way all the way up to politics. In other words, I think the idea of supranational governance and even supranational banking under some auspices of the World Bank, something like that, I think those things sort of peaked. I think support for those things peaked a few years ago, and I think they've fallen off now. And so I think a more decentralized future awaits. And look, we know what the problems are with the dollar and how sustainable that is. And that's really what underpins America, right? That's how we pay entitlements. That's how we keep food on the shelves. That's how we, keep things going. And as long as Americans are materially okay, they might accept it. But it sure feels like we are at an inflection or tipping point where things are going to become more localized or more regionalized. And I think COVID really accelerated that trend with the Great Migration, people moving from one state to another and, really coalescing more around shared interests and that sort of thing. So people are thinking about protecting themselves. And that's a healthy and necessary thing. I don't know how it'll look. It won't be easy. But yes, I would say I am cautiously optimistic.
Well, in closing, thank you very much for being here with us tonight, Mr. Deist. And before we let you go, do you have anything to plug or anywhere people can follow you at?
No, I'm on Twitter at Jeff Deist, all one word. But otherwise, I think this This Discord group is great, and I'm going to look forward to keeping up with it.
Awesome. Thank you very much.